The desert wind howled like a wounded animal as Maria Blackfeather stumbled through the darkness, each step an agony that shot through her battered body like lightning. Blood seeped through the torn fabric wrapped around her feet, leaving a trail that she prayed the tracking dogs wouldn't find until dawn. Her lungs burned with each gasping breath, the dry Arizona air scraping her throat raw as she forced herself forward through the mesquite and creosote bush that tore at her already shredded clothing. 3 days. She had been running for 3 days since escaping the forced labor camp hidden in the canyon 20 miles south of the territorial border. 3 days without food, surviving on nothing but the moisture she could squeeze from cactus pads and the iron will that had sustained her people through generations of persecution. The memory of that hellish place still clung to her like smoke, the crack of overseers' whips, the groans of dying workers, the stench of unwashed bodies packed into wooden barracks that trapped the desert heat like ovens. Maria had been torn from her village 6 months ago, part of a midnight raid that the territorial government claimed was about relocating hostile Apaches, but which everyone knew was really about acquiring free labor for the copper mines. Her husband had fought back and taken a bullet to the chest for his trouble. Her 2 children had been sent to one of those boarding schools back east where they tried to beat the Apache out of Indian children and replace it with prayers and English grammar. She had been shackled and marched south with 50 others, most of whom were already dead. The camp had been a vision of hell carved into the red rock. Men, women, and even some children forced to work 16-hour days breaking rocks, hauling ore, their backs bent under the merciless sun while armed guards watched from the shade. The food was barely enough to keep them alive, watery soup and moldy bread, just sufficient to ensure they could work another day. People died regularly from exhaustion, disease, or the guards' casual brutality. The bodies were dumped in an unmarked ravine that the workers called the Canyon of Bones. Maria had survived by making herself useful in ways that kept her out of the mines. She cleaned the guards' quarters, washed their clothes, cooked their meals. She smiled when they wanted her to smile, laughed at their crude jokes, and pretended not to understand when they discussed things they shouldn't say in front of prisoners. And she planned. Every moment she appeared compliant and broken, she was memorizing patrol patterns, noting which guards drank themselves stupid at night, observing where the weaknesses in the fence line lay. Her chance had come during a moonless night when the camp cook had fallen ill and Maria had volunteered to prepare the evening meal for the guards. She had access to supplies that ordinary prisoners never saw, including a bottle of laudanum kept for the camp doctor's use. It had been almost too easy to doctor the guards' coffee, watching them grow drowsy and confused as she served their dinner with downcast eyes and a submissive posture. By the time they realized something was wrong, Maria was already through the weak section of fence she had been gradually working loose over the past month, a section hidden behind the latrine building where the guards rarely ventured. She had run north, guided by the stars her grandfather had taught her to read when she was a child, back when her people could still move freely across the land that had been theirs for generations. The desert that would kill most white men was her ally now, offering concealment in its arroyos and canyons, providing sustenance if you knew where to look. But even the desert couldn't hide her forever, and she knew the guards would send trackers once they discovered her absence. The camp couldn't afford word getting out about the conditions there, couldn't risk her reaching civilization and telling what she had seen. The moon was rising behind her, casting her shadow long across the sand, when Maria's strength finally gave out. She had reached the foothills where the desert began its transformation into something greener, where juniper trees clung to rocky slopes and the promise of water whispered through the darkness. Her vision swam, black spots dancing at the edges as blood loss and exhaustion finally overwhelmed her body's ability to continue. She collapsed against a boulder, her breath coming in shallow gasps, knowing that if she closed her eyes now she might never open them again. That was when she smelled it. Wood smoke, faint but unmistakable, carried on the evening breeze from somewhere upslope. Where there was smoke, there were people. Where there were people, there might be help, or there might be those who would turn her back over to the camp for the reward money she knew they would offer. Maria had no choice. She couldn't go any further on her own. Whatever happened next would be in the hands of fate and whoever tended that fire. She hauled herself upright, using the boulder for support, and began to climb. Every step was a negotiation with her failing body, a promise that this would be the last one, just one more, just reach that tree, just make it to that ridge. The smell of smoke grew stronger, joined now by the scent of coffee and something cooking. Her stomach cramped painfully at the thought of food. Through the darkness ahead, she could make out the warm glow of lamplight spilling from windows, the shape of a small cabin tucked into a clearing surrounded by pines. Maria staggered into the clearing, her vision tunneling, the cabin swimming in and out of focus. She could hear sounds from inside now, the clank of metal on metal, footsteps, someone humming a tune she didn't recognize. She tried to call out but her voice had abandoned her, reduced to a croak that wouldn't carry past her own ears. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet as she lurched toward the cabin door, her hand outstretched. She made it 3 more steps before her legs gave out completely. Maria fell forward, her shoulder striking the cabin's wooden door with a thump that sounded impossibly loud in her ears. She tried to rise, tried to call out, tried to do anything but lie there helpless on this stranger's doorstep. But the darkness that had been threatening at the edges of her vision finally rushed in like a flood, and Maria Blackfeather knew nothing more. Inside the cabin, Jacob Coleman froze at the sound of something hitting his door. In 3 years of living alone on this remote homestead, he'd had plenty of unexpected visitors, deer, coyotes, once a black bear with an interest in his food stores, but none of them had ever knocked. He set down the pot he'd been scrubbing, dried his hands on a rag, and reached for the rifle that hung above his door. A man didn't survive alone in this territory by being careless. Jacob opened the door with the rifle held ready, prepared for anything except what he found. A woman lay crumpled on his doorstep, her dark hair matted with blood and dirt, her clothing torn to rags that barely covered her body. Even in the lamplight spilling from his cabin, he could see the marks of violence written across her skin, bruises, cuts, the raw circles around her wrists and ankles where shackles had worn the flesh raw. She wasn't moving. For a moment, Jacob simply stood there, his mind trying to process the scene. Then training older than his life in this cabin kicked in, memories of battlefields where hesitation meant death. He propped the rifle against the doorframe and knelt beside her, his fingers finding the pulse point at her throat. It was there, thready and weak, but present. She was alive. Jesus Christ, he muttered, though he wasn't a praying man anymore. He'd left that behind on the fields of Antietam along with his faith in humanity and his left eye. He slid his arms beneath the woman's shoulders and knees, grunting as he lifted her. She was lighter than she should be, all bones and sinew beneath the rags, the weight of someone who hadn't eaten properly in a long time. He carried her inside and laid her on his bed, the only bed in the small cabin, before rushing to light more lamps. In the better light, the extent of her injuries became clearer. The woman was Apache, that much was obvious from her features and the few scraps of beadwork still clinging to what remained of her dress. Her feet were wrapped in bloody rags, her hands bore the calluses of hard labor, and her back, when he carefully turned her to check, was marked with the parallel lines of a whip. Jacob had seen enough scarred backs during his years in the cavalry to recognize the signature of systematic brutality. He worked quickly, drawing water from his pump and setting it to heat on the stove, gathering clean cloth for bandages, retrieving the medical kit he'd assembled from supplies ordered through the trading post in Prescott. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he began cleaning the wounds, starting with her feet. The soles were torn and infected, embedded with thorns and sharp stones. She must have run for miles, maybe days, to reach this place. As he worked, Jacob's mind churned through possibilities. An Apache woman, brutalized and shackled, running through the desert in the middle of the night. It didn't take much imagination to figure out what she was running from. He'd heard stories about the labor camps, whispered tales in saloons and trading posts, officially denied by the territorial government but persistent enough that everyone knew they existed. Mines and ranches using, relocated, Indians as forced labor, justified by paperwork that made it all seem legal and proper. Jacob had seen how the government could make anything seem legal when it suited their purposes. The woman moaned softly as he cleaned a particularly deep cut on her arm, her eyes moving beneath closed lids but not opening. Jacob murmured something soothing, though he didn't know if she could hear him or would understand his words if she could. He'd picked up a bit of Apache during his cavalry days, enough to negotiate safe passage or trade for supplies, but not enough for real communication. It would have to be enough. He spent the next 2 hours tending her wounds, cleaning and bandaging, treating infections with carbolic acid that made him wince in sympathy even though she remained unconscious. Her ribs stood out starkly beneath her skin, evidence of prolonged starvation. He covered her with his spare blankets, tucking them around her carefully, and then sat back in his chair to consider what he'd gotten himself into. Harboring an escaped prisoner, if that's what she was, could bring him serious trouble. The territorial authorities didn't look kindly on anyone who interfered with their labor programs, regardless of how brutal those programs might be. They could confiscate his land, burn his cabin, or simply shoot him and claim he'd resisted arrest. Jacob had worked hard to build a life away from the violence and politics of the world, a simple existence where he answered to no one and bothered no one. But looking at the woman in his bed, at the evidence of cruelty written across her body, Jacob knew he couldn't turn her away. He'd spent 3 years trying to escape his past, trying to forget the things he'd done in the name of duty and country, trying to build something clean and honest out here in the wilderness. What kind of man would he be if he sent this woman back to the hell she'd obviously escaped from? What would that say about whether he'd really changed at all? The answer was simple, even if the consequences might be complicated. She would stay until she was healed enough to make her own choices about what came next. He would keep watch and keep quiet, and if anyone came looking, well, he still had his rifle and he hadn't forgotten how to use it. Dawn was painting the eastern sky pink and gold when the woman finally stirred. Jacob had dozed fitfully in his chair, jerking awake at every sound, and he was instantly alert when he heard her breathing change. Her eyes opened slowly, confused at first, then widening with fear as she realized she was in an unfamiliar place. She tried to sit up, gasping with pain, and Jacob raised his hands in what he hoped was a calming gesture. "Easy now," he said softly. "You're safe here. You collapsed at my door last night. I've tended your wounds, but you need to rest." She stared at him, her dark eyes moving from his face to the room around them, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the simple furnishings, the rifle above the door. When her gaze returned to him, there was calculation there along with the fear. She was assessing the danger, looking for escape routes, preparing to run again if necessary despite her obvious injuries. "No one knows you're here," Jacob added, reading her thoughts. "And I'm not going to tell anyone. You understand English." She gave a slight nod, her hand moving to her throat where bruises suggested she might have difficulty speaking even if she wanted to. Jacob nodded and stood slowly, keeping his movements careful and non-threatening as he crossed to the stove. "You need food and water. I'm going to bring you some broth, nothing too heavy for your stomach. You've been starved, eating too much too fast will make you sick." He ladled soup into a bowl, the same venison broth he'd been living on for the past 3 days, and brought it to her along with a cup of water. Maria, though Jacob didn't yet know her name, watched him approach with the wariness of a wild animal. But when he set the bowl on the small table beside the bed and stepped back, she reached for it with shaking hands. The first sip made her close her eyes, and he saw tears leak from beneath her lids as she drank. Whether from pain or relief or simply the overwhelming exhaustion of survival, he couldn't tell. The first week passed in a strange routine of careful silence and cautious trust. Maria slept most of those early days, her body demanding rest to heal from months of abuse and 3 days of desperate flight. Jacob maintained his regular activities, tending his small garden, checking his trap lines, chopping wood for the stove, but always staying within earshot of the cabin. He slept on the floor near the fire, wrapped in a blanket, his rifle within easy reach. On the 3rd day, Maria spoke her first words to him. "Thank you," she said in English rough from disuse and injury, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob had been changing the bandages on her feet, and he looked up in surprise. "You're welcome," he replied simply. "Can you tell me your name?" "Maria." She paused, seeming to weigh whether to say more. "Maria Blackfeather. From the White Mountain Band." "Jacob Coleman," he offered in return. "Originally from Pennsylvania, but that was another life. Can you tell me what happened to you?" She did, slowly and with many pauses, sometimes in English and sometimes in Apache when the English words wouldn't come or when the memories were too painful to speak in the language of her captors. She told him about the raid on her village, about her husband's death and her children's disappearance into the boarding school system. She described the camp in the canyon, the brutal conditions, the bodies in the ravine. She explained her escape, though she kept the details of how she drugged the guards vague, perhaps worried that he would judge her for it. Jacob listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening as the story unfolded. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. There are people in Prescott who might help, he said finally. Some of the Quaker missionaries, maybe the newspaper editor. He's been writing pieces critical of the territorial government's Indian policies. Maria shook her head firmly. They will find me if I go to town. They cannot let me speak of what I saw. Too many important men profit from that place. She met his eye directly. I need to reach the reservation at San Carlos. I have cousins there. They will hide me until I can find my children. San Carlos is 100 miles from here, maybe more, Jacob pointed out. And you'll have to cross territory where you'll stand out like a sore thumb. Even if you heal completely, traveling alone. I have done impossible things before, Maria interrupted. I will do this too. Over the following days, as Maria's strength slowly returned, an unexpected companionship developed between them. Jacob found himself talking more than he had in years, telling her about his life before the cabin, about the war and what it had taken from him. He spoke of Antietam and the moment a Confederate sharpshooter's bullet had taken his eye, leaving him with the scar that ran from eyebrow to cheekbone and the leather patch he wore over the ruined socket. He talked about the things he'd done under orders, the villages he'd helped burn, the people he'd displaced, all in the name of manifest destiny and military necessity. I thought moving out here, living alone, working the land with my own hands, maybe it would balance the scales somehow, he said one evening as they sat by the fire, Maria finally strong enough to leave the bed for short periods. Or at least let me forget. But you can't really forget, can you? It's always there. No, Maria agreed softly. You cannot forget. But you can choose different actions now. That is all any of us can do. She told him about her life before the raid, about her husband who had been a gifted horse trainer, about her daughter who loved to sing and her son who could track a rabbit across bare rock. She described the rhythms of Apache life, the seasonal movements following game and edible plants, the ceremonies and stories that connected her people to the land. Listening to her, Jacob began to understand what had been lost when the government forced the Apache onto reservations, more than just freedom of movement but an entire way of being in the world. On the 10th day, Maria was standing at the window looking out at the pine forest when she suddenly tensed. Someone comes, she said quietly, and Jacob was beside her in an instant, following her gaze down the trail that led to his cabin. 3 riders were approaching, still a half-mile distant but clearly heading his direction. Can you walk? Jacob asked urgently. Not far. Not fast. You don't need to. There's a root cellar, accessed through a trapdoor in the floor behind my workbench. It's cool and dry down there, and there's space enough to hide if you're quiet. Go now. Maria moved as quickly as her healing feet allowed, and Jacob helped her down the ladder into the cellar before replacing the trapdoor and shoving the workbench back into position. He scattered sawdust across the floor to hide any signs of disturbance, then checked his appearance in the small mirror hung by the door. He looked like what he was, a solitary homesteader living a simple life. Nothing suspicious. Nothing worth investigating. The riders proved to be exactly what he'd feared. 2 were obviously hired guns, hard men with cold eyes and well-maintained weapons. The 3rd was better dressed, a territorial marshal's badge pinned to his vest, though Jacob noted the man's eyes held the same mercenary quality as his companions. They dismounted in his yard without invitation, and the marshal called out. Jacob Coleman. Need a word with you. Jacob stepped out onto his porch, his rifle held casually but ready. Something I can help you with, Marshal. Looking for an escaped prisoner. Apache woman, probably injured, would have passed through here about 10 days ago if she headed north from the canyon country. You seen anyone like that? I see Apache sometimes, Jacob said carefully. Hunting parties passing through, families traveling to visit kin on different reservations. All legal and proper. But no woman alone, and no one who looked like a prisoner. What's she supposed to have done? That's not your concern. Point is she's property of the territorial government, assigned to a work detail, and she needs to be returned. The marshal's hand rested on his gun belt, not quite threatening but not friendly either. We have authority to search any premises in pursuit of escaped prisoners. You have a warrant. The marshal's smile didn't reach his eyes. Don't need one for a fugitive Indian. Maybe not according to territorial law, Jacob replied evenly. But this is my land, deeded and recorded proper, and I'm a citizen with rights. You want to search my cabin, you come back with paper from a judge. Otherwise, I've told you I haven't seen your prisoner, and you can be on your way. The standoff lasted several heartbeats, the marshal weighing whether to push the issue. Jacob's finger rested near his rifle's trigger, and he knew they could all see that he knew how to use it. The war had made him good at killing, and some things you never forgot. Finally, the marshal nodded slowly. "We'll be back this way in a few days," he said. "If you happen to remember seeing anything, there's a $50 reward for information leading to her capture." "That's good money for a homesteader." "I'll keep that in mind," Jacob said flatly. He watched them ride away, staying on his porch until they disappeared from sight. Even then, he waited another hour before helping Maria out of the root cellar. She emerged pale and shaking, whether from fear or from the strain of staying still in the cool darkness, he couldn't tell. "They will come back," she said as he helped her to a chair. "And next time they will bring more men, or they will not bother to ask permission." "I know," Jacob admitted. "Which means we need to get you to San Carlos before they do. You're not healed enough for the journey, not really, but we're out of time." Maria looked at him sharply. "You think I'm going to let you walk 100 miles through hostile territory alone? I may not be much, but I know the land and I can shoot straight. If we travel smart, move at night when we can, avoid the main trails, we might make it." "Why?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. "Why risk everything for me? You do not know me. We are not kin. This is not your fight." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as he searched for words to explain something he barely understood himself. "Maybe it's because I've spent 3 years trying to pretend the world's problems aren't my concern," he said finally. "Maybe it's because I'm tired of running from what I was and what I did. Or maybe it's just because you knocked on my door and I answered, and that means something. I don't know. But I know I can't send you out there alone, and I can't sit here waiting for them to come back with enough men to burn me out. So we go together, or we don't go at all." They spent the next 2 days preparing for the journey. Jacob packed supplies carefully: dried meat, hardtack, coffee, medical supplies, ammunition. He filled canteens and water skins, knowing that water would be the most critical resource once they left the mountain country for the desert approaches to San Carlos. He fashioned better wrappings for Maria's feet and gave her his spare boots, too large but better than nothing. He taught her how to load and fire his revolver, pressing it into her hands despite her protests. "I cannot take your only pistol," she objected. "It's not my only weapon," Jacob replied, gesturing to his rifle. "And you need to be able to defend yourself if we get separated. Don't argue. Just learn." On the evening of the second day, they set out. They traveled north initially, away from San Carlos, to lay a false trail in case the marshal and his men were watching. Only when they were several miles from the cabin did Jacob turn them east, following game trails and dry stream beds that would hide their passage. They moved slowly, limited by Maria's healing injuries and the need for stealth, covering perhaps 8 or 9 miles that first night before making a cold camp in a thick stand of juniper as dawn approached. The journey became a rhythm of movement and rest, walking through the cool nights and hiding during the dangerous daylight hours. Jacob proved to be a skilled guide, reading the land with an ease that came from years of solitary wandering. Maria's strength returned gradually, her feet toughening, her stride becoming more confident. They spoke little during the night marches, saving their breath for the miles, but during the day as they waited for darkness, they talked. Maria taught him words in Apache, the names of plants and animals, phrases of greeting and respect. Jacob shared his knowledge of the stars and the patterns of weather, pointing out the signs that promised rain or warned of approaching riders. They were both survivors, both people who had lost everything and rebuilt themselves from fragments, and in that shared experience, a bond formed that transcended language and culture. On the 7th night, they reached the broken country that bordered the San Carlos reservation. Here the land was a maze of arroyos and mesas, perfect for concealment but also perfect for ambush. Jacob moved even more cautiously, his rifle always ready, his eyes scanning for any sign of danger. They were nearly there, so close that failure now would be unbearable. They saw the lights of the reservation agency buildings from a ridge at midnight, scattered points of lamplight in the darkness below. Maria stood staring at them for a long time, her hand gripping Jacob's arm. "I can find my way from here," she said quietly. "You have done more than I could ever repay. Go back to your cabin, your life. You have earned that peace. Will you be safe?" Jacob asked. Your cousins, they'll hide you from the authorities. Yes. My family is large and we take care of our own. And the reservation is crowded enough that one more woman will not be noticed, especially if I am careful. She turned to face him fully in the starlight. But what about you? They will know you helped me. Your cabin is just a cabin, Jacob interrupted. I can build another somewhere else if I need to. Hell, maybe I will. Maybe it's time to stop hiding from the world. He managed a small smile. You said we choose our actions, that's all we can do. I'm choosing to believe this was the right action. Maria reached up and touched his scarred face gently, a gesture of blessing or farewell or simple human connection. You are a good man, Jacob Coleman. Better than you believe yourself to be. May your path be blessed with beauty. And yours, he replied in his rough Apache. May you find your children. He watched her pick her way down the ridge toward the scattered lights of the reservation, her figure growing smaller until the darkness swallowed her completely. Jacob stood there for a long time after she disappeared, the night wind cold against his face, before finally turning back toward the mountains and whatever future waited for him there. The cabin would likely be gone when he returned, burned by the marshal's men in retribution. His peaceful isolation would be over, and he'd have to start again somewhere new. But as Jacob Coleman walked through the desert night, alone once more but somehow less lonely than he'd been in years, he found he didn't mind the prospect as much as he thought he would. Some things, he'd learned, were worth the cost. Some doors were meant to be answered when desperate people knocked.